Well, it is 11:01, so I guess we can start. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a presentation on treaties with Chief Scott McLeod from Garden Village. So thank you, Scott. I appreciate this. And I'll let you give your presentation.
Okay. I don't see anybody on here, so it's hard to tell who I'm talking to. But
okay, yeah, it's a webinar, so we won't be able to see them.
Oh, okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Or in my language, I would say Anin Kinawea. That means hello, everyone. I was asked to do a talk, and because this month there's Treaty Recognition Week, I thought I would speak about treaties. So before I start about that, I'm going to just talk a little bit about Nipissing First Nation, which is the community that I am currently chief of. So our reserve base of lands is essentially runs from the city limits of North Bay, right by Duchesne Falls, all the way to the town limits of Sturgeon Falls. And for a good portion of that, our land base is on the north side of the highway as you travel west from North Bay towards Sturgeon. We're situated on the northern shore of Lake Nipissing, and our community has been here for over 10,000 years. We have archaeological artifacts and data that verifies, our community being in and around this area. And this area was considered the heart of a lot of trade routes for since that time. It was a natural trade route because of the French River, access to the Great Lakes, and also eastward with the Ottawa River going all the way up into Quebec City, and then eventually to the eastern coast of Canada. And also to the north of us, which was most predominantly Cree nations, whereas we are considered, in English, it would be Ojibwe, but we refer to ourselves as Anishinaabe. We had the Cree to the north of us, and there was also more Anishinaabe Huron groups that were to the west of us. So we were a very important gatekeeper of a lot of the early trade routes. So when I talk about treaties, it's important to recognize that treaties were used well before European contact. As you may or may not know, North America, what we know as Canada and the US and Mexico today, back then was filled with many thousands of different nations, of different cultures and backgrounds. When people think of Indigenous people, they tend to think that we're all the same, that there was like only one race of Indigenous people, when in fact there was many nations, and no different than the nations in Europe, for example. To consider us the same people would be more or less considering people from Poland and people from France the same. And obviously that's not the case. They have different languages, they have different cultures. So it was the same here, and there was a lot of nations, a lot of people here prior to contact, and there was a lot of well-established trade routes and economies that were going here. It was, most people don't recognize these lands as being anything of that sort until contact happened. But in reality, there was a lot of trading go on. There was a lot of commerce. There was a lot of business deals and territory acquirement and wars even. So there was a lot of that going on. And the reason I start there when I talk about treaties is because the treaties were a critical process on establishing relationships between those nations. So there wasn't fighting going on all the time. The nations made agreements with each other, and those were the early treaties. And the difference being is that the treaties that were came from the typical what we know as treaties today was more or less from the European side of the ocean, where they had written documents with details describing word for word what those treaties would contain. Whereas on this side of the ocean, our treaties were represented by the use of what we call wampum belts. And those were sacred agreements between nations. And to give you an example, one of the early, from the 1600s, treaties that were signed between the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, it was called the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty, which was signified in a wampum belt with an image of the one dish, two people, and parallel lines. And what that represented was that both nations required a shared territory to exist. That dish was representative of the territory that they needed to share in order for both of them to survive. So their treaty essentially was a peace treaty that recognized each other's governments, recognized each other's need to access the resource. And so they shared these territories in order to harvest food, medicines, anything that they needed, and it was understood that they would share. So we were quite well versed in treaties because essentially a treaty is, in more modern terms, a document that lays out the rights of each party, the responsibilities of each party, and how that relationship is going to exist in a peaceful manner. So that's what treaties are based from, and those existed long before contact. But once European contact was made, it changed the way things were being done. It had an impact on a lot of the resources that we were currently already trading. Now with this new partner that came into our lands and wanted some of the resources, there was a need to establish further treaties, and they date back as far as the early 1700s. I believe 1701 is one of the first treaties that was ever signed between Britain and the Indigenous people. And essentially, they were following the same type of relationship agreements as the Indigenous people were used to signing, except in a different symbolic way. Instead of writing it down on a piece of paper, ours were done on a wampum belt. But they were both understood, and they were both honored, or were meant to be honored. So there was a lot of competition for the resources, increased competition, which created a lot of havoc and unsettling some of the nations of how their relationships were, because everybody kind of wanted a piece of this new economy that was emerging from the Europeans that came over here. So a lot of the early treaties were establishing these new relationships on how they would go about doing business. And really, a lot of these early treaties were just peace and friendship treaties, and they really just wanted to keep the peace while they were here. And but eventually, as Britain started to grow, it led to them acquiring territories. So these treaties started to evolve somewhat. That would include sharing of the land and the resources, and it led to there was a 7-year war in the mid 1700s, and essentially Britain more or less took over the territories in the parts of Canada from the French, and there was a need to renew or revive the treaty making process. So in 1763, they signed, or sorry, Britain put forth the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And essentially what that Royal Proclamation was Britain saying that they were going to, if they were going to acquire any more lands in Indigenous territory, there was going to be a process and how they did it. And it was going to be a peaceful process that would recognize the rights of the Indigenous people that were already there. And so in this proclamation, there was things that were said that the Indigenous people should not be molested or disturbed, that they were essentially to be allowed to live the way they have always lived, and live in harmony with the new colonies that were starting to form from Britain. So it was really an important document, this Royal Proclamation of 1763, because it laid down the framework on which Canada would be built on as we moved further in history. So there was a process there of instead of wars and conquering nations, there was peaceful treaties that were signed that would establish these relationships that were going to occur in the future. So from that Royal Proclamation, it laid down the British policy, and Indigenous people were quite well aware of that. And so in different areas, when there was interest for the Crown as they started to move inward into what we know now as Canada, they started to use that process to develop their colonies and create these relationships as they moved inward with the Indigenous people. Now, where I am situated in Nipissing First Nation on the North Shore, this area, there was a treaty that was signed in 1850. And so by using the process of the Royal Proclamation, a fellow by the name of Robinson signed the treaty with 21 communities, 21 First Nations in this area here, which essentially was known as the Huron area. So this happened in 1850. So the treaty is known as the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And in that treaty, the purpose of it from both sides, because a treaty can't be signed by one party. It's beneficial to both parties. So those mutual benefits were, from the First Nations point of view, was to protect their inherent way of living, the way they have lived all throughout these years. They didn't want that to change. They didn't want to give up their nationhood. They didn't want to give up their culture, their language, anything that they were already doing. They were quite content and rich in the sense of healthy communities and healthy trade routes and abundance of food and necessities. So they didn't want any of that to change. And the mutual benefit on the British side was that they had these new areas that they could access resources that were needed across the ocean back in Britain, and establish these colonies and make it part of the Commonwealth of Britain. So that was the intent. That was the spirit and the intent of why these treaties were signed. However, history takes a bit of an abrupt change after 1850, and in 1867 is when the British North American Act was signed between the newly formed colonies here in what we know now as Canada and the British Crown, essentially wanting to become their own nation. And so that was signed, and it's important to know because this is where the foundation of what this country was built on, is that the British North American Act was not an agreement with Indigenous people. It didn't have, we weren't signature to it. It wasn't even necessarily discussed with us at any detailed level as to how it would impact us in the years to come. But essentially, what we understood was that the transfer of the responsibility of these treaties were going to this newly formed country, which was the Dominion of Canada. We know now as simply Canada. So that happened in 1867, and so the legislators, the people in government in Canada in those early years, they had their sights on accessing the timber and the resources that were in the country. So they continued to make treaties westward towards British Columbia at that time. But they also, as they progressed, they also found it, for whatever reason, less and less appealing to honor these treaties, and that it was just becoming more of a formality to get treaties signed so they can, get what they wanted, which, was the resources. And they started to look at Indigenous people as kind of being a problem that was in their way. And now that they were independent of the Crown to a certain degree, they started to change their legislation and their policies. And that's when things started to really go wrong for Indigenous people. By 1874, I believe, they passed legislation, again, without agreement or without signatures or without necessarily even talking in great detail about what the impacts would be to us, they passed the legislation known as the Indian Act. Now, the Indian Act, which is still in practice today, was a very race-based piece of legislation. In other words, it only applied to Indigenous people of that race. So, and it had a lot of restrictions. It essentially took away almost everything that we had intended on protecting with the treaty. And in a sense, the treaty was blanketed with this piece of legislation known as the Indian Act. And it took away our rights and freedoms of practicing our culture, our language. It created the residential schools that you've probably heard so much about. And the reason why, and this goes right back to John A. Macdonald and Duncan Campbell Duncan Campbell Scott, was to get rid of the problem that they perceived Indigenous people to be. And in fact, there's quotes that you can look on online or at the library of the way that they were thinking and how they looked at this to be an Indian problem, right? That's how they coined the phrase Indian problem. And they created these residential schools to take away everything we knew about who we were and what our culture was, essentially our identity. And it was thought that they would assimilate us into the settler population and just become no more Indians. And that was obviously not right, but it also failed miserably. So in that act, it took away a lot of our abilities to just not even be recognized as a human. The only way we can be recognized, and it said this, as a person in Canada, was if we were to give up all our rights of being Indigenous, essentially to denounce our Indigenous heritage, and that's how we would acquire essentially human rights. So you could see that this was a very big problem for Indigenous people, and at the time, the colonial government thought this was the way to handle this problem, and that it would relieve them from all their treaty responsibilities. The things that they promised and the things that they were guaranteeing us would not be impacted. They were just essentially bypassing all that and trying to instill their power over the nations. So we still, like I said, we still live under the Indian Act. There's a lot of things that have changed today. However, the act still exists. We are somewhat recognized as nations, through the reaffirming of Indigenous rights in the Constitution, the revised Constitution of 1982. But it really falls short of us being truly First Nations, to be truly a nation, because we still we don't determine our own fate. The government still does that. The government still tells us who is our members. We have no say as to who is status Indian. That's a term that the government uses to qualify us as Indigenous people. So as a nation, if you think of nations, Canada being a nation, US being a nation, it would almost be like the US telling Canada who their citizens are. That wouldn't, Canada wouldn't be considered a nation if another nation was telling them who their citizens are. So just to give an example of the complexity of the issues that we lobby government to change, determining who is our own people is one of the biggest things, because that Indian Act was designed to legislate us out of existence. So in a sense, if we didn't have enough blood quantum, that's the other tool they use to determine if we're Indigenous or not, then they wouldn't issue us a status card. Then we weren't Indigenous anymore, and then they weren't responsible for us anymore. So as time would go on, and our families marry off reserve or other ethnic backgrounds, we keep losing our members. Myself, if my daughter, my current daughter, marries her current boyfriend, who is non-Indigenous, my grandchildren from them would not be recognized as Indigenous. So that's how the legislation works to get Canada out of the responsibilities of the treaties that were signed with us, is by not recognizing us as Indigenous anymore. And there's some communities that essentially within the next 30 years won't have any status Indians or recognized Indigenous people on that reserve. So that reserve will essentially disappear. So that's why we fight government to change this act, and we're pushing them to honor the treaties that were signed. So it's a very crucial fight for Indigenous people to get this to happen. There has been, like I said, some movement on it through the, Truth and Reconciliation report, where they're changing bits and pieces of the Indian Act, but rest assured that the Indian Act is still imposed on us. And again, I use that word imposed because we didn't agree to it. This is something that has to be looked at, because in Canada, in Britain's own courts of law, they recognize the treaties are legally binding obligations. They're not just a piece of paper that was written a long time ago. It was the foundation of what Canada was built on. And it's still as legal today as it was in 1850 or 1700, whenever the specific treaty was signed and agreed upon. And there's hundreds of treaties, over the time throughout Canada, and modern day agreements, which are essentially like treaties. So there's a lot of those, and they're legally binding. And it's the fight of Indigenous people to get Canada to honor these treaties, because I wrote a piece earlier this month during the Treaty Week, and it was like hard to imagine that we've been signing treaties with the Crown, which is now Canada, but at the time was Britain, since 1701, and not one treaty that was signed was honored by the Crown, but all of them were honored by Indigenous people. So you can see how problematic that has been for us. And it creates, there's a lot of complexity in Canada's history. Even the citizenship issue that I always raise is I always ask, when did Indigenous people become Canadian? Because if you look, and I don't say that for any malicious or protest or anything like that. It's just actual fact. Like if you look at history and how Canada became Canada, I question this because if the Dominion of Canada, the British North American Act, was signed in 1867, which gave the settling colonies here a new life under a new nation, which was Canada. And that agreement, the BNA, was signed between the settlers and the British Crown, not the Indigenous people. So when it became Canada, we weren't involved. We didn't sign, we didn't agree. And then they imposed this Indian Act legislation on us in 1874, which again, we never signed or agreed to. We never agreed that we would give up our nationhood. So I'm not sure, and I've asked this question to scholars and to legal people and to Canadian politicians. I think I may even ask Prime Minister Trudeau that same question. Is when did we become Canadian? If we didn't give up our nationhood and we didn't sign any of those documents that made Canada Canada, I'm not sure when we actually or how we actually became Canadian. And again, I'm not saying that as any protest or argument about Canadians. I'm just saying it out of actual history. And, I don't think you can just place a nationhood on another nation. And in fact, when the Canadian government a couple decades ago recognized that we are nations within a nation, that says something. And I don't think they, even though it was the government that said it, I don't think they actually believe it because they don't treat us like a nation. They treat us like a First Nation, which has kind of developed its own type of meaning, but I don't think they really see us as nations. We're still in like a reserve mentality, and which doesn't really do justice to the treaties or the people that my own community that were signature to those treaties. The whole spirit intent of these treaties were to maintain our nationhood, maintain our culture, all these things that were basically stripped away from us under the Indian Act. So I still question, when people ask me my nationality, I say Anishinaabe, and I live in what's known as Canada. But I don't necessarily recognize myself as a Canadian citizen. I recognize myself as an Anishinaabe citizen from my nation, which is in what is known as Canada. So it's very complex, but it's a very complicated situation that the colonial government has created with Indigenous people, and the entire plan of assimilation and wiping out our nations failed miserably. And now we're in a process they're calling reconciliation, of trying to essentially right all the wrongs that were done. But some of them are so deeply entrenched in Canadian legislation that it's complicated to get out of this. And the other complication to get out of this is, like, people say, well, do you believe that they should just get rid of the Indian Act? And surprisingly to some, I say, no, we can't. Because what has happened over the last, since 1874, when the Indian Act was first um, um, imposed on Indigenous communities, is we lost a lot of our nationhood, our ability to function properly, because now we had to do what was said under this Indian Act, and it created a lot of problems with our uh, government systems within our nations, and we became these Indian Act bands that were dependent on government funding and government telling us what to do for over a century. To simply get rid of that could be detrimental to a lot of communities that don't have any built up capacity of running their nation. And that's part of the problem. There are First Nations like my own community of Nipissing that are looking to break away from the Indian Act. We have a lot of capacity built within our administration and our governance system that we would do fine. But to simply get rid of the Indian Act for some would leave a lot of our First Nation communities in peril because they don't have that same capacity as Nipissing or Wikwemkong or some of the other nations that are very strong. So we have to look at ways of dismantling it. Rather than just throwing it out. We have to make changes, and that's what we've been working with government to try and do. We are currently looking at moving out of parts of the Indian Act. There's something that's called the Anishinaabe Nation Governance Agreement. It's not truly self-government, but what it does, it takes us out from a very restrictive piece of legislation known as the Indian Act and slides us over under a First Nation lands, almost like a lands management act, which gives us more authority to make decisions and of our future and what we want to do. Because right now in most things that we do, we have to get approval from government according to the Indian Act. We have to follow that. So it would move us into a less restrictive piece of legislation. That's something that our community is going to be looking at voting on in the next few months. But people, some people feel that that's not true self-government, and it's just another piece of legislation, which is true. But it does give us more room to maneuver and puts more authority within our own governance to be able to make decisions for our community. It's not perfect, but it's better than staying under the Indian Act. And so that's what our community needs to discuss and vote on in this coming year. Other nations are doing the same thing. Some have already moved forward and successfully made that change under the new piece of legislation. So there's things that are happening, but it takes time. It's frustrating for a lot of the grassroots people because they're not immersed in the talks and just really seeing how complicated things are. So it gets frustrating for them, and which in turn makes it my job a little bit frustrating because I try to move and do things as fast as I can, but with any government, it's a very slow process, to say the least. And then when you add, this era of COVID on top of that, it becomes very problematic. But we continue to move forward, and we continue to have those discussions, and I continue to lobby government and try to educate people on the real history of Canada and what's wrong with the current situation with Indigenous communities, and just give a better understanding of some of the issues that Indigenous communities face that no other Canadians have to deal with on a daily basis. And it's important to know that when non-Indigenous people go to school, go to work, make money, pay taxes, do all those things that seem quite normal. Those are all the benefits of being here, because the treaty was signed. So essentially, non-Indigenous people are party to these treaties. They don't look as these treaties at really something that impacts them or has anything to do with them, but it actually does, because, like I said earlier, treaties can't be signed by one party. And the Crown signed on behalf of the non-Indigenous people so that they can be here and they can, live and prosper and take advantage of this beautiful country. Those are the benefits when I talked about mutual benefits that Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, have been enjoying since the treaties were signed. And on the other hand, we have the other side. We have Indigenous communities that are struggling with drug addictions, loss of language, loss of culture, loss of identity, loss of our children. All due to the Indian Act and the government of that time. So you could see the mutual benefits were not there. We weren't allowed to continue living the way we always lived here, which was a rich life, a good life, and very strong in culture and beliefs and language. And that was essentially taken away when we signed these treaties, or shortly afterwards. So we continue to fight, and we continue to try and educate everybody about what it is that we have issues with. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining in and listening to me talk. I'm quite passionate about the work that I do. So if you have any questions, you can get them to me through Francine or however we want to do this. But I just want to say Shimigwich for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Scott. If anybody does have a question right now, they can ask. I have a question for you, Scott.
Sure.
You know how you said, so if your daughter were to marry outside Indigenous, the grandkids would not be Indigenous. Mm-hmm. At all. So
well they would be, but they wouldn't be recognized by government. Yeah.
Okay, so do you think that's going to deter a lot of people from getting married and having children because of this?
Well, I think it does play a role in who some of our young people choose to partner with, which is, to me, is fundamentally wrong. I believe that marriage and creating families should be based on, love and all those natural things that occur, right? But to lose your Indigenousness because of who you marry is a really ridiculous concept, because that would be saying, like, if you were to marry somebody from outside of Canada, you could risk losing your Canadian citizenship, right? It doesn't apply to any other Canadians, but it applies to Indigenous people in their nation, right? So that's what makes it very problematic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's to compare. I always get that question. Well, you don't look Indigenous. How much Indigenous are you? And I usually say, well, you don't look Canadian. How much Canadian are you? It doesn't make sense from a nationality perspective, right? For me, I when they ask me how much Indigenous, I say 100%. I mean, I have some lineage from some of the early settlers that were here from Scotland with the Hudson Bay, but I've always been part of this nation. I've always been part of this community here in Nipissing. I've never lived anywhere else. I've never, so to me, that's what makes me Indigenous, not my blood. That's not what necessarily makes me Indigenous. It's who you are, what you identify yourself as. And in my case, I have no choice. I've never been anywhere else other than living in my nation. So.
Right. Does anybody else have a question? Allison said, thank you, Scott. Lots to reflect on.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, well, this was a really, really good presentation. Thank you so much, Scott. Like, this is, it's heartbreaking to hear, right? Because you guys have been treated unfairly, and so you have my support 100%.
Yeah, it's really, you know, when most Indigenous leaders like myself want to talk about this stuff, it's not to make anybody feel guilty, but we have to put the facts out there. We have to talk truths, and that's the only way things will ever change. Is to talk about these things. It's just like any other problem, whether it's, you know, a problem in your marriage or a problem with your parents or, you know, a problem at school. If you don't talk about them, they don't get fixed. Right. And so this is just, you know, the same thing. We're talking about a relationship between different nations. And if we don't talk about the truths about that, how can we come up with ways to reconcile if we don't speak those truths? So.
Exactly. Yes. And yeah, I believe everybody should be educated on this. And yeah, so it's a very good presentation.
All right. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Yes,
and
I really did. Thank you so much.
Okay, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.